Okay. Oops, I want that there and this down there. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Markowsky, and today, welcome to my studio. And today we're going to recreate another painting by another one of my all-time very favorite artists. Today we're going to be looking at the art of Roy Lichtenstein. And this is an artist that is very important to me because for probably the first 5 or 6 years of my professional art career, I was basically a disciple of this artist, accused of ripping him off, and maybe there was a little bit of that when I was getting started, for sure. And so it's really exciting for me 25 years later to come back and take a look at this artist anew with fresh eyes, and to see if we can do our best to paint this painting as faithfully as possible, although we'll get into some of the difficulties of actually trying to do exactly that. So we're going to do a little compromise that is actually going to be a lot more like a pointillist painting than one might imagine right off the bat. Okay, so looks like lots of people here in the chat. Wow, looks like Deborah, Heidi, Donna, Gail, Tanya, lots of folks there, lots of familiar faces. So welcome. We are we're going to do the outline for this painting in a moment. So if you're new to the show, every single one of these episodes I create an outline on my iPad Pro using the Procreate app, and I also enlarge the image to make it fit onto a 9x12 sized canvas. This original image is actually a square formatted painting. So actually, if we were to look, we'll look at the original here, but it's somewhere more like that is what the original painting looks like. So I have enlarged the top or added more on the top and the bottom than were originally there, just as full transparency. But let me see. I don't want that on there. Hide markup toolbar. Okay, so first of all, there's a private Facebook group just for people like yourself. Upload your version of today's painting to the Facebook group, and next weekend I'm going to go through all the awesome art that's up there and give feedback to everyone, because it's been a little while since we've done that, since prior to the new year. So it's about time because there's a lot of new people that have joined us, a lot of new stuff that is on this group, which is really, really exciting. I love seeing all of the engagement in here. So anyway, you'll also see a link to the Dropbox folder, and that's where you're going to find the outline. So all of our easiest paintings are at the very top of the folder, including some of the very intro images. You'll see these are all paintings we have already done. So if you're like, I don't know if I want to do today's painting, there's a lot of other paintings that you could do. There's certainly something for everyone here. And here's where we are at. Roy Lichtenstein. Roy Lichtenstein. I'm pretty sure it's Lichtenstein. That's just the way that I've been saying it, and the way I've always heard everyone else saying it. Anyway, you'll see these 3 files in there. You've got the original, or I guess my version of the original with the extended top and the bottom, and then of course the outline as well. And there's 2 versions of the outline. One's a JPEG and one's a PDF. We're going to get into the biography of this master in just a few moments. What I want to do is get the outline started and apply a little bit of paint so that while that's drying, we can get into the actual project itself here. Oh, and there's Greg says hello Mike, or hello Michael is what he says. So let's do this. Let's just take a look at so here's the outline. I just printed it out on my inkjet printer here at home. And also, this is what we're going to be doing next Thursday. We're going to be doing a famous painting, a grisaille, or a study that was painted by Leonardo da Vinci. And that'll become important why we're actually doing that painting. And this is what we're going to be doing on Tuesday, just as a little bit of a heads up on what's coming down the pipeline. So to get this image onto the canvas, we've done this many times before, as I'm getting ready for the next 100 or so paintings, I usually try to get these drawn on the canvas, and I kind of show a quick preview of them first. Since I'm doing other things in the background, I haven't had a chance to do this. So what I've done here is I've taken this canvas, which I bought off of Amazon. I'm not the biggest fan of them. That's why I'm not telling you which name brand they are and providing a link for it. There are other ones that I prefer to this one, which are in the description below. So anyways, once I buy them, I open the plastic, I put a little bit of gesso on. Again, we've talked about this in one of the very first episodes for this series. And then I'm using a 220 grit sandpaper. I'm just going to lightly sand it to get some of the texture. I want it to be, the smoother it is, the easier it is, in my opinion, to make a painting. And there's, a little bit of newspaper. It looked like got stuck to the front there. And then you can see here's a little bit of the newspaper as I pulled it off there, so I can just quickly sand that off. As maybe unsightly as that can seem, personally, I often rely on this little bit of newspaper on the back to remind me that it's actually been gessoed, because sometimes I've got a lot of materials kicking around the studio, and sometimes if I do them perfectly so nothing sticks on the back, I'm like, did I gesso this one already? So it's funny how maybe a mistake like that becomes part of my own working process, because it's actually very helpful for me. If I didn't have that, we'll look at often what I would do on my paintings, the ones that I make and sell, is I'll actually make a little note on the back saying gessoed once, or gesso one tick. If I have gesso it twice, I do another tick on the end there. Okay, so this painting, technically, we could put it right in the middle, the outline. I'm actually just going to move it a little bit further over to the right. So I'm going to just add a little bit of extra detail here. And I think that's okay. So that'll do fine. And sorry, I'm just using some carbon transfer paper, and you can use graphite tracing paper. This is single-sided, so I always have to remember to put the shiny side down. The shiny side has the actual graphite on there, and I've mistakenly done this and gotten halfway through one of these outlines and realized, oh, there's nothing on the canvas because I put the wrong side down. So with these outlines, you could be very careful about trying to do the front and the back of all of these, in other words, go like this on either side. I am just going to go kind of right down the middle, which is going to mean my version might differ slightly as the painting unfolds, because I'm just putting one line in the center rather than one line on either side, if that makes sense. Instead of doing the boundaries of the line, I'm just doing sort of the center of that line, right? Mostly just to save a little bit of time. It's literally going to, shave off half of the time it takes to do these outlines. But also a little bit just because one thing that I often find, even myself doing, and I try to encourage people not to do this, is if I've got a really detailed outline, what ends up happening is I end up getting really anxious about doing anything that, you know, it's sort of, I become very anxious about not obeying the outline, right? Because it's like, oh, all those lines, they're in the right place, and if I do anything other than put these in the right place, this painting is just going to fall apart, and you know, if I put the line right in the middle, it just sort of forces me to make some creative decisions as to kind of, where am I going to put that line? I got to do a little interpretation, which, you know, is potentially going to mean the painting is going to look a little bit different by the time I'm done. And I'm okay with that, personally. In fact, it's sort of kind of nice when the painting is a little bit different. It makes it just a little bit more my own, and rather than just a simple copy of the original. And there's something a little bit satisfying of having, you know, added your own slight interpretation to the original, even if it's very close to the original. You know, it's sort of one of those kind of fun things that you can do later on, is sort of go, oh, you know what, you know, like those children's games, like, you know, we have these books that we look at with our daughter that have two nearly identical images, and what's the difference between these two pictures? Now, I know probably some beginners are like, well, I don't know about that. I'd rather have people go like, wow, look, there's no difference between these two. You're a genius. So I can understand both ways of doing it. This is just the way that I'm gonna do it, right? And let's just do these stripes here real quick. Right, you want to make sure that before you take the tape off of here, the lines are indeed all there, and we don't have like an eye missing or anything. Like if one of these lines in the hair was missing, again, that all of that pretty much is something that I've added on top of there. So if some of those lines are a little bit different, that's okay, because they were never there in the first place. Okay. And I'm going to save this, right? I can recycle it, or I can use it again to make a second version of the painting. Okay, so I think I'm going to just continue with my typical approach, which I think, do I want to do that? Let me just think about this just for 1 second. Maybe it's worth actually at this moment just showing you how much I used to really like Roy Lichtenstein. So this is a painting. I don't know if it's dated. Oh yeah, there it is, 1998, which was a while ago. So this is J. Jonah Jameson, the character, the editor of the Daily Bugle, which is a fictional newspaper in the Spider-Man Marvel universe, right? And this is not based on a actual Roy Lichtenstein painting. It's my version of how he would have done something like this. So I'm using the sort of Ben-Day dot pattern, and the Ben-Day dot is this small dots that you see. You know, if you look at any newspaper, well, I think the printing process has changed over the last 20 years, but traditionally for about 80 years prior to that, from let's say the 1920s to the 2000s really, you would have this screen pattern to help simulate color, right? So if you really looked up close with a magnifying glass, this is what you would see. It wouldn't be quite as obvious as this, but anyway, this is, so the process I used to make this painting is just using a brush and making all these little dots individually. And then, like for instance, this here, to make this what kind of looks like a yellow-green, I actually did all of these blue dots and then covered it with some yellow, so that it turns these blue dots and yellow into what appears to be kind of a greenish color, right? And same sort of thing, you can't really see it in here, but we have some a brown, which is done with some blue dots with a red crosshatch over top of it. And then for this purple, there's blue and red dots. So this is an old painting I have had forever. Look how dusty it is on the top there. Okay. Let me see. Greg says, crap, I already did all the outlines. I don't really, I wonder why. If your outlines look like this, Greg, I think you're totally fine. Everything looks great. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of my warm yellow, and I'm going to apply this. This is what I've been doing for a while. In my mind, I was thinking maybe I should shift it up a little bit and do something that was a little bit more akin to what I used to do. But I think I'm just going to continue with this method, because I kind of like the results that we get. And it's what this is going to do is give this painting just a slight aged yellow, when we're done here, aged yellow type of a surface that will look a little bit like a comic book. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this warm yellow across the whole surface, and it's also going to help lock in the pencil lines so they don't get too smudged. Is smudged? Is that an actual word? It sounds Shakespearean or Victorian. The canvas, a smudged canvas. Okay. So you do not have to do this if you don't want to, and I'll show you this. If you wanted to skip this, you could wait just a couple of seconds here for this to dry, and then I'll show you what the next step is, and you can kind of combine them together. Like, by all means, I hope I never come across as like, this is the way to do things. If you don't listen to me, then you're a fool. I just sort of think that some of the methods that we're exploring work quite well, especially for sort of beginner artists. But even if you're a more advanced artist, some of these techniques I think are worth thinking about, if not using them entirely the way I use them, as to considering how you might approach this type of a situation. So maybe while this dries just for a second, I'll just show you one thing. What I used to do when I would make these paintings is actually the very first thing I would do is I would coat the surface with a little bit of gel medium, like a heavy matte gel, or it could be gloss gel, it didn't really matter. And I don't know if this is gonna, if you can really see this, maybe if I turn the canvas over, because I wanted the look of the paint sort of blobbing over the surface. I used to think of these as like cakes, like I was decorating a cake and I wanted this icing to come over the edge. Mostly because I wanted it to look like an object and not like an image, which is something that painters talk about. So the first thing I would do is put that right over top of the canvas, and then I would paint this color here. And this color is called unbleached titanium white. And you can buy, this was just right from the tube is how I would apply it. And what that means is it's sort of like whole wheat bread. That's just off the top of my head as I think about it, because it's the pigment before it's been bleached, just like white toast is. I don't know how the difference technically between white toast and whole wheat toast is, but you know, there's some process that takes out all the good stuff out of the whole wheat bread, and then you're just left with this really tasty thing that is just empty in terms of its beneficial content, right? So same sort of thing. You have this unbleached titanium that has a bit of that eggshell kind of color. And so I would apply that over the surface, and that would really give me the illusion, or not entirely, but it would kind of make the painting look like it was an old newspaper. So you could mix that, or you could use, I don't even know if I have unbleached titanium here to paint with. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this dry, and then I'm actually going to paint some white over top of it, just sort of very delicately. I'll put some matte medium in it as well, just so that it's a little bit more transparent, right? And it does seem like this is a bit of a make work kind of project, and maybe it is, but you know, the way that I think about this type of a thing is that, you know, we could mix, oh, that sounds, Greg says Liquitex makes a color called parchment, which is similar. Interesting. I have not heard of that. That's worth investigating for sure. The way that I think about this, is it's like the difference between if you were to make a dough and mix cheese into the dough versus making the dough and applying cheese over top of it, right? So this is sort of like a layer of cheese, and then we put the dough over top of it, versus mixing it all in together at one time. The results are going to be, for the most part, very, very similar, but they're not exactly the same. There is a difference, and by the time this painting is done, that difference will be negligible for sure. I'm just going to allow a little bit of that yellow to come back into this color. I have a fear that I may have put a little bit too much white in here, and this could be a little bit opaque, so yeah, that's pretty strong white. So I'm just going to put a little bit more matte medium in there just to make it a little bit thinner. You know, I'm going to blow dry this, just that way if I start trying to paint over top of this surface before it's dry, it's going to drive me crazy because I'm going to be kind of wiping some of that wet paint away. So let's just take a moment to blow dry this. Okay, so we will see here just how opaque this is by putting a little bit more of that matte medium in here. It's clear, so the idea is that it's going to make the paint a little bit more transparent. And as always, you know, if you're worried that it's going to be too opaque and you want something to be transparent, it's always better to err on the side of making it more transparent, because then you could just add a little bit more, do a second coat. So, what is all that floaty stuff on the surface? That's strange. Something in this mixture. Maybe my palette wasn't quite clean enough. Oh well. That's life, hey? So we'll see. I'm not, all that little chunky stuff is still there, but if I can be careful enough to try to brush it out, the only thing that starts to happen is the paint starts to dry, because as it gets a little bit thinner, it's going to start drying, right? So we just have to be mindful of that, trying to go kind of quickly, because if we take too long, then we're going to start pulling the paint away. So I got maybe another 5-10 seconds here before I just have to leave it as it is. Now, of course, we're going to cover everything with paint. So as if this is not totally even, you know, if this was my own painting, I would probably, you know, have taken a little bit more time in this particular part of the, you know, the way I approach this here, but I think that's pretty good. It's a little bit kind of a messy thing. So I like this. I can see why some people are just like, that is loony. What on earth are we doing here? And and you'd be right to question myself or any other teacher about their process, for sure. And I don't think you should just accept my word for anything. And you should experiment, and you should try different things and see what works best for you. But I think for me, I'm happy with the way that that's begun. It is a little bit, it's not as even as I would have maybe hoped for it to be, but Donna says, I should have dusted my room first. Dog hair and fuzzy wuzzies in my paint. That's pretty. I like that. Okay. So now that this is all set up and starting to dry, let's take a moment to look at the biography of Roy Lichtenstein. And where are we? Okay. So born in 1923, dies in 1997. So he lived a really nice, long life. You know, age 73 is still maybe younger than maybe most people would like to live. But for many artists, especially some of his contemporaries and the generation before, the abstract expressionists, who a lot of them died drunk, you know, in their 50s and 60s, making it to 73, I think, was probably an accomplishment for artists of this era. One of the things I think about Roy Lichtenstein a lot about is I wouldn't say he's like a businessman artist, but he certainly doesn't fit the archetype of the wild, drunken artist of the previous generation. And when I think of that, I think it's like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, all of these abstract expressionist painters who were very testosterone, guys who, and again, most of them were men. There were female abstract expressionists, but the group that we think of, they're men who were, who wanted to be seen as, that they could possibly be football players, but they happen to be painters, right? Things kind of start changing with this group. Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, the pop artists were very much sort of the antithesis of that type of that type of artist, and certainly the antithesis of that kind of art. So let me just see, what do we want to talk about in terms of his biography? So he was born and raised in an upper middle class family in New York City, and he, from a young age, he's really interested in music and in art, and he spends time making drawings of musicians and actors when he goes sees music and theater at the Apollo, which is an awesome theater in Harlem. If you haven't been to to the Apollo Theater in New York, next time you go visit there when things return to normal, you've got to go see Showtime at the Apollo. What an incredible experience that is. My wife and I went there recently, or I guess 3-4 years ago, and it is a lot of fun. And definitely a New York institution. And Harlem is a fantastic, beautiful part of New York to visit if you haven't been. Anyway, so in his last year of school, he starts taking classes at the Art Students League of New York, which we've talked about the Art Students League a number of times because the Art Student League features very prominently in the biography of lots of artists, right? This was a really, and it's still around, a really important cultural institution in the history of art in New York or the United States, arguably of the world, right? So many important artists. I remember when I was there, I went, I had some friends that were artists there, that were teachers. They're now friends, but I remember we had I met them there, and we had some dinner, and then they said, "Oh, would you mind washing the dishes?" And I was like, "Oh, sure." I was, I think, 18 at the time. And after washing the dishes, they came back and they said, that where you just washed those dishes, that's where Jackson Pollock used to wash dishes, because he used to work here in exchange for art classes. And it's one of those things you're like, wow, the taps I was just using, that's Jackson Pollock stood there and washed dishes, as like, I don't know, those things mean something to me. I don't know about anybody else, but so he starts kind of getting more and more interest in arts, goes to the Ohio State University, which is interrupted by World War II. And although he doesn't go to Europe and serve, he doesn't see combat in World War II. Obviously, he did all the basic training, and there was, World War II didn't just end. There was sort of like a long kind of, some would say even just went right into the Korean War right afterwards. But afterwards, he gets the GI Bill, and which helps pay for his education. He returns to the Ohio State University, and one of his teachers, Hoyt L. Sherman, becomes his greatest influence. And we'll talk about Sherman and some of the techniques he did, because I think as a teacher myself, again, I teach at Emily Carr University here in Vancouver, some of his methods I think a lot about. They're really, obviously it made a huge impact on Roy Lichtenstein, because he was very taken with this instructor, and I don't know if it mentions here, but later on, oh yeah, just right here. So later on, when he donated money to his alma mater, he named the one of the important rooms on campus, not after himself, but after this teacher who had played such an important role in his life, which I think is commendable, right? You're giving money and not just naming it after self, but somebody from that institution who is important. Sanders says, World War II, minor interruption. Is that how I put it? Oh, my goodness. What else do I want to say here? After he graduates, he starts teaching at a number of different places. He gets married, has a couple of children. In fact, I was just watching a really great interview that's on YouTube with one of his sons talking about his father, and I didn't know that side of Roy Lichtenstein's life. I just sort of was more familiar with, obviously, the art itself, but I didn't really think about his family life. And it appears to be he was like a really great dad, which is, as an artist and father myself, it endears him even more to me. What do I want to say? So, he's teaching. He's also starting to experiment a little bit more with his style. And if we just I think from here we can just sort of start looking at the art itself. And that doesn't have any of his really early art here on WikiArt. The early art that he was doing was a lot of what was popular at the time, like Cubism, Expressionism, and Abstract Expressionism, right? And because that was Abstract Expressionism was an American art movement that quickly took over the whole world, and before you knew it, everyone is doing these very gestural abstract paintings like Jackson Pollock, right? Not Rothko, less so, like Willem de Kooning, I guess, who we're going to be looking at doing Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning paintings over the next few months together as well, a few of them. But what's interesting is, there's this story that one of his sons talks about. I think it was in that YouTube video of, the kids sitting around reading the Sunday morning newspaper. One of the kids points at a Mickey Mouse drawing and goes like, "Oh, Dad, I bet you can't do anything as cool as that. Like, that's a really cool drawing. And look at the kind of, stuff you do is kind of fun, but this Mickey Mouse is really cool." And I think it kind of sets off a little bit of an idea, like, could I make a painting that could be taken seriously as a painting of Mickey Mouse, right? Does it always have to be these really high concept paintings of kings and queens and heroic figures, and or on the other side, like Van Gogh, like people working in the fields or landscapes? What about all of this material that we're surrounded by all the time? Like the magazines and newspapers, billboards, signage everywhere, right? And it's funny, in retrospect, it's like, oh, of course that would be, you could incorporate that into your art. But at the time, it was radical. And when Roy Lichtenstein started making these paintings and exhibiting them, they actually did fairly well quite quickly. I think there was a number of collectors, especially because he was showing at Leo Castelli Gallery, which was one of the most important art galleries really in the history of art in New York City. So that added a layer of legitimacy to his art. But at the same time, the reaction, the critical reaction to this type of art, when Roy Lichtenstein starts making paintings like this is one of his most famous early paintings, this Look Mickey, and was fierce. People were not happy, especially the old guard, the abstract painters like Mark Rothko and de Kooning. They thought this was was not only just bad art or not art. That was a label. It was like, that's really not art. That's advertising, or it's copying. Not only was it like that, but it was essentially sacrilegious. That to take a comic book, this trash that people read and throw out, and to make a painting of it, like, ugh, that is just so gross. Like, why? It's like taking a fish out of the garbage that's been sitting in a dumpster for a week and taking it back home and eating it. It's just like repulsive. And yet clearly he was onto something, right? It resonated with people who are like, whoa, I never thought of, why do we treat one type of drawing in a comic book differently than we take a drawing by Picasso on a napkin, right? That drawing on a napkin, we could sell it for, the most expensive sports car that exists, and Picasso did it in 5 seconds and tossed it to the side, versus a comic book that somebody worked on for months, if not years, is 25 cents and then goes into the gutter afterwards, right? So really, really powerful effect that it had on society. And we would even say that that effect has continued on for generations afterwards. The whole idea of popular culture or pop art is, popular music, pop music, right? As opposed to classical music or jazz, serious person's music, right? A couple questions about copyright, and that is definitely something that comes up. Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol were both sued by comic book writers and artists. Andy Warhol was sued by Campbell's Soup until Campbell's Soup realized that Andy Warhol did more basically cemented Campbell's Soup as a brand for all time by making a painting of it, right? So whereas they thought like, oh, he's just ripping this off and he's making money off our brand, they're like, whoa, we can now, he's legitimized Campbell's Soup as an essential part of American culture. But there definitely, yes, there were many lawsuits that happened over the years over this work. And there were arguments over how much Lichtenstein did to change these images to make them more of his own. But you can also see that we're going to make the original version of this painting over the next few months. This woman with flowered hat, originally by Picasso. One of the things that Lichtenstein also does is not only taking comic books and so-called pop culture or low culture and making images, his own versions of them, but he's also taking, things that have been legitimized by the gatekeepers of culture as high art, and he's making paintings based on those. And there's a long tradition in art of artists making their own interpretations of other artists' artwork, right? Doing exactly what we're doing today. This is how artists have been learning how to paint for centuries, right? Let me see. Like here we've got a Mondrian that he's done. This whole period of time where Lichtenstein starts getting into the brush strokes, I think is really, some people really love this. Some people are like, whatever. I think it's his sort of take on, it's kind of a funny, like tongue-in-cheek approach to his own version of abstract expressionist painting, because abstract expressionism is just the brushstrokes, splatters of paint, and for him to make a painting that is a kind of a cartoon image of a paint's brushstroke or splatter is I think very, very funny. And then he starts transitioning into these sculptures and doing public artworks. Let's let's just kind of continue here. You know, here's a version of Matisse. Anything else I want to mention? I love these two. These sort of his late artworks where he actually does start to apply the paint in a kind of abstract expressionist way, coupled with his kind of more graphic version of those brushstrokes. And then you can see, you may have seen, if you've been to New York, there's a number of these big, large public artworks that he did. You can see Van Gogh's bedroom. Anyway, so let's one of the reasons that the reason why we're making this painting today is it is, I think, we are going to, over the next 5 months, go through this list of the most expensive paintings that have ever been created until we get all the way up to here, the Salvator Mundi supposedly by Leonardo da Vinci, which sold just a few years ago for $450 million. So we are going to make all of these paintings here on this list. And here we are. I think this is number 40 on the list. So this is where we're beginning. Obviously, that we could just keep on going, but I think starting 40 of these paintings I should be enough. And that will allow us to tackle some artists we haven't looked at, like Cezanne, Barnett Newman, who are some other Mondigliani, Gauguin, Munch, Renoir. So there's a lot of artists there we haven't tackled yet. Anyway, I think this is almost dry. I might just blow dry this really quickly. So, let me do that for just a quick moment. Okay. So the other thing, another reason why I like putting a bit of that white in here is it also reduces the opacity of the line work, which is, we're going to paint over every single line with black paint. But let's say I get kind of excited and I want to take a little bit of a detour. By having that a little bit lighter, I'm not so worried about missing a line or whatever. Okay. So, to execute this painting, what we're going to do is fill this up with little dots, which is going to be a bit time-consuming, but the results are going to be really cool by the time we're done. And we talked about doing this with the when we did a pointillist painting by Seurat. And let me see, do I have the kind of paintbrushes I typically use for that process? I don't think. So the easiest way to do this is to use a paintbrush that is really kind of short and stubby. And that's my opinion. And I did hundreds of these types of paintings again at one point in my life. So I'm going to use that type of paintbrush. It's a little less common. You'd have to buy these specifically from the art supply store. If you don't have that, what I would go for is just kind of like one of your smaller paintbrushes. Right, that is maybe just not quite as long. The reason why is we don't want to have too much paint going on here. The more paint that we have on our brush, the bigger the blob is going to end up being of paint, and that can be, usually that's a great thing. When we're making this type of painting, it can be kind of frustrating. So the other thing that, in fact, I'm just going to take a look at this painting that I did in the past. And we can see that this color here is much closer to, it's sort of, little bit, it's got a bit of a warm quality to it, but it's also closer to magenta. And magenta is our cool color. And if we think about how we use this process, or how the printing process works, they use essentially 4 colors: CMYK. C is it's cyan for blue, magenta for the red, yellow for the yellow, and black for K. They call it K, or chromatic black, as opposed to, otherwise you'd have CMY. Why didn't they call it B? CMYB? I can't remember. Anyway, so I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to start out, I'm going to basically paint a lot of little red dots on here. And I'm going to, and rather than putting all of the paint on my palette, I'm going to basically mix my cool red and warm red together. And I'm not, even though I'm going to use a lot of paint, I don't want to put too much on my palette at one time. Otherwise, this paint will start to dry and get kind of thick, and so I'm going to take my warm red and cool red, just mix this together, maybe a little bit more of the magenta. The only reason I'm not going full on magenta is magenta tends to be a bit more transparent, and I don't want to have to go over top of my dots many times. So that should be good. The other thing that I'm going to add, I used this last time. I want my self-leveling gel. Where did I put that? Oh, here we are. Got too many different fluids here. So what I'm going to use is self-leveling gel. I'm just going to add a little bit into this, and I also did that when we did our pointillist painting, the Eiffel Tower, because it the point of this is it's going to try to get some of the peaks that form when we paint. And I again, you can watch that video to see how I used this and why I used it, because it did work really well, and I showed a little bit of the difference between these. So I'm not going to put too much in, because if I put a lot in, it's going to make this paint transparent, and I don't want it to be transparent. I want it to be still as opaque as possible. But self-leveling gel, the idea behind it is it will reduce the texture of brush strokes. So self-leveling, rather than if we make a kind of a dollop of paint, rather than it looking like a Hershey's Kiss with a point. In fact, let me just do this. I did this drawing last time, but you know, if we take our paintbrush with paint and we try to make little dots with the paint like that, we might get these little tiny points, right? And as they dry, they might dry like that. We want, or at least I want, something that looks a little bit more like that. And the self-leveling gel, what it does is it helps level this out. It helps get rid of the texture of the brush and gets a little bit more of that dome-like shape. So artists who want like a very flat non-textured surface like to use a self-leveling gel for that exact reason. Okay, so Gail says, so what happens if you don't have self-leveling gel? Just like Pascal says, it will make bumps, mini hills. Again, this I could do it without that gel. I'm just adding a little bit of it because I've got so many different mediums that I've got to use this stuff at some point, right? But also I just think it's helpful for people to see, you know, because when you go to those art supply stores, you see like all these different gels and you're like, why would anybody buy all this stuff? What is it useful for? Well, this is one of those instances. Okay. That is interesting. When I did the template, oh, I did a version of this. I just realized that had lines on it. I guess I forgot to. I'll fix that in the future. The reason I did that is that way we could try to get really nice straight lines. I'm not really going to be able to do that. I mean, that way I could just sort of start anywhere. So to do this, instead, I'm just going to do all these little dots, and I'll just try to keep it as vertical as possible. And I'm just going to start on the left. This is going to be time consuming. So, and I'm going to make these just a little bit bigger just to kind of help speed up this whole process. And so here in this painting, let's just show them side by side. So what I'm going to do is do all the dots down here, but I can go right through her hand because this is also red as well, right? And then afterwards, I'm going to stagger it, and I'm going to go in between. Oh, I'm trying to anyway. You can see it doesn't always turn out that great. You know, you kind of miss a little bit. It's been 25 years since I've done a painting like this, so yeah, let's see how much muscle memory kicks in. And then we come back up here. So when I used to do these types of paintings, I would use a little bit of a smaller brush, and I'd also take a lot more time. I'd go very slow. This is a very slow process. And this is also different than the way Roy Lichtenstein did his paintings. You know, he very quickly, he might have done a few paintings like this, all by hand, doing all the little dots by hand. And there was a really great exhibition probably about 20 years ago called Hand Painted Pop. And somewhere around here I've got the exhibition catalog, and it shows some of the early pop art paintings which were all done by hand. Very quickly though, they started using various industrial processes to help make these paintings much faster, which sort of makes sense conceptually, considering like pop art is, you know, about this whole based on mass manufactured images and products, to actually, as artists start adopting some of those same methods to create their artwork, made a lot of sense conceptually. So very quickly after he kind of started using comic books as his kind of source for making images, he used silk screening processes to use a screen to create all of these dots in his artwork, which is, might seem like a very for some people like cheating for him to just use a screen to help apply all that paint. But it would have also, I was thinking about it just today, like how complicated it would be to silk screen images onto canvas, and to get the image to kind of be as clear as what he did. It's not easy to do, man. Like, that is, there's must have been a lot of trial and error as he was making some of these early paintings. Now, you might see as I start doing this, it does get a little confusing as to where my initial lines are here. And when I used to do this, I got very used to being able to kind of see through all of these dots to find where the original lines were. But as I'm doing this, I'm just realizing, you know what, that this might be really difficult for some people. So one of the things you can do is you can paint all of your lines with black to begin with, and then just go back over top of the lines or the areas where the dots have layered over the outline. Or you could just use a pencil and kind of darken them a little bit. I wouldn't use a Sharpie if you can avoid. A Sharpie is just not a particularly great tool for using in art, because it's not archival and it's going to change color as time passes. Oh, and these lines can go right up here. Again, I always think of like my pencil lines and the outlines as just sort of a guide to get the painting started. And if there's going to be a little bit of distortion or change, then so be it. Let it happen. But I know that for some people that causes a lot of anxiety. So we've done this many different times for different kinds of art, is just painting these lines in. I think I am just gonna continue this way, but I can see why some people would want to, like, because I mean, as I do this, I'm kind of obliterating the face, right? Everything kind of disappears, and then it's a bit of like hide and seek to find where the actual black lines will go. And if you're just doing this for the first time, it's going to be maybe a little bit, you're going to have some dots that are a little uneven, some bigger and smaller, right? We the same sort of thing when we were doing the Yayoi Kusuma paintings, with all those little dots. Once you see those and you realize, like, wow, she was really good at doing dots. It's hard to do dots and to have them look relatively uniform. So with the lips, I'm going to leave them like this, and then afterwards I'll probably go and just enlarge them a little bit, make the space in between them a little bit smaller, but I'll just wait to do that. So I see. I'm sorry. All these comments in here. People are, yeah. There's gonna be a little bit of texture. I'm gonna have a little bit of texture in mine too. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with texture. Roy Lichtenstein did not paint this painting like this, even though, you know, I see Pascal saying yes, it was much bigger. It was like 4 feet by 4 feet. This is not how he did it. He did not paint all these dots by hand. He used a screen to apply, like, the screen had little dots on there, and he would put tape on where the dots are not supposed to go, which was, you know, just as in many ways also very complicated. And then you would use, like, you'd put paint on one side and then pull it with a what do you call that? It's like a squeegee, I think it's called in printmaking. So this is sort of like, in some ways this is more akin to like how I used to make paintings than how Roy Lichtenstein made paintings, because in order to do the paintings as he did it, we would have to build a screen, and it would be, you know, you're setting up a silk screening studio for yourself, which is not necessarily super expensive. It's just very time consuming and requires like some tools that probably most people don't have at their disposal. Look at all you folks painting along with me. That is awesome. I'm trying to think. There was so many stories I could tell about this artist, because having spent so much time looking at his art, thinking about it, thinking about him as an artist, you know, we can also talk about just pop art in general. You know, one of the great books about pop art was written by Andy Warhol. It's called, in fact, let's just bring it up on the screen here. Taking a while to load, so while that's loading up, I'll just keep on painting. Man, what's going on here? Okay, there it is. Okay, so this book is called Popism, the Warhol 60s. This had a very different cover when I read this book 20 years ago in a class in college. But, you know, some people would probably be surprised to hear that Warhol was a pretty thoughtful, articulate person, because he liked to sort of cultivate the idea that he was a bit aloof, and but this book, Popism, the Warhol 60s, is like an invaluable and very easily readable book to help understand the kind of the art world that pop art kind of grew up in, what the kind of prevailing trends were at the time. Warhol talks about going to the Cedar Tavern, which was a bar in New York City where all of the famous painters at the time used to hang out. And, you know, he talks about running in, like physically bumping into one of them. I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Robert Motherwell, maybe. And how one of those like they were physically rough guys. Like, they were big painters and they were tough, hard drinking men. And Andy Warhol bumped into one of these guys in the bar, and they knew who he was because they didn't like him or Lichtenstein and any of the other pop artists. And this guy, I love this story. He, again, I'm trying to remember who it was, takes out a pencil, and in Andy Warhol's face, he takes out a pencil and then a knife, and he just starts right in front of Warhol's face, starts sharpening it into a nice sharp point, and then puts it like right up to his nose. And he's like, I can't remember what he says, but the threat was basically like, you're just a fraud. All this pop art, none of you guys actually knows how to draw. You just steal other people's images and you make paintings out of them. You're just as low as dirt. And Warhol just talks about, like, whoa, that, like, the animosity, the intensity of that type of reaction at the time to what these guys were doing is, it's hard to really to think about today, because, you know, most people, you know, don't really see art as having as something worth getting in a fight over, right? There's not, you know, there's occasionally, you know, maybe Banksy is the most controversial artist of our time, but most people is like, it's kind of like okay, sure, whatever, kind of yawn. But there was a time where, you know, the type of art you're making, it was more like being in a gang or something. You know, like, you chose your sides, and then you live and breathe that kind of thing, which is why we looked at an artist named Philip Guston maybe 6 months ago, who was a Canadian abstract painter from Montreal. And he kind of in the 1960s stopped making abstract paintings and started making very cartoony, very strange paintings, and we did a few of them. And all of his abstract painters basically just stopped talking to him. They were like, you've lost your mind. You have gone over to the dark side. You're making pop paintings now, or what might be they would have considered pop paintings. Is like, no friend of mine makes pop art, right? I mean, I just find that stuff very funny. But it was very serious for Guston. He lost all of his closest friends by choosing a different, approach to painting. It's kind of seems ludicrous today, but now we live in a world that in the art world and philosophers would call postmodern, right? And postmodern means this idea of, it means a whole bunch of things, but just for this discussion is this idea of artists being able to sort of pick and choose and combine whatever style they want, and that mixing and matching the idea that there, quote unquote, is no style is the style, right? Versus in the past where things were much more defined as to like what was the right way to do things and what was the wrong way to do things, and postmodernism is the sort of embrace and of just any whatever works, basically. And we could go much further down the rabbit hole talking about postmodernism, but that's so many people would say that the time we're living in is this postmodern age, right, where artists mix and match. There's people who would say, oh, I'm a cubist, or I'm a impressionist painter, and you're like, well, impressionism ended I don't know, 150 years, and they're like, yeah, that's fine, but I'm still making impressionist paintings. Pascal says you could try using a mosquito screen. You could. I think you're just going to end up having a grid. Like the paint is not just going to go right through those holes. You could, manufacture something like this using like a 3D printer to make your own screen that you apply paint through. I've thought a lot about different things you could build to help speed up this process, and never quite. And I experimented with a few different things, getting things from the dollar store and using a hole punch, and lots of time and energy spent trying to chase down those leads without any success. I think it was in that hand-painted pop show where it showed this screen that Roy Lichtenstein used for some of his early paintings, which was like this kind of flexible piece of, I don't know, it was like aluminum or whatever, that had holes drilled into it that he would lay down onto the canvas and then kind of use a roller to go over top of it to do some of his earliest paintings. But he talked about using that only for a short period of time because the paint would not go on as sort of evenly as he wanted, and sometimes the paint would sort of bleed underneath and just cause these big blobs, which he did not like. Warhol, on the other side, on the other end of things, really embraced all of the imperfections. And we're going to be doing a few Warhol paintings that are famously misregistered. We're going to be doing his famous car crash painting as part of this, the top 40 most expensive artworks ever sold. We're also going to be doing his 8 Elvises painting. And there's a few different techniques I want to explore to do those. So I think we'll try actually creating our own stamp, and I'll show you different kinds of tools because I have a bunch of them in behind here, but that's not for a few more months already, so I won't go too far down that way. You know, we've been talking a lot about Warhol while we've been painting this painting by Roy Lichtenstein, which is maybe not fair to Roy, because the two of them were forever linked, because they were the two most famous pop artists, and they, I mean, some people will group Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg into the discussion of pop art, but they were sort of more like what is often called like proto-pop artists, in that Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns was the artist, remember for American Independence Day, July 4th last year, we did a white flag that he did, which I think sold for like $80 million, so almost made this list. I think it's on the list, but not quite this far down, or high up, whichever way you want to think about it. So Rauschenberg and Johns are sometimes mentioned as pop artists, although I think of them more as like proto-pop artists. They kind of helped make the transition between abstract expressionism and pop art, because both of them, their work was much more raw than Warhol, and certainly Lichtenstein. Like Lichtenstein's paintings, there's like a cleanliness and orderliness to them, a slickness that made them much more palatable to some people, and for other people it was a sign of them being, you know, some people didn't want paintings to be that slick. They're like, if I want a painting that looks like it was done by a machine, I would just go buy a poster, or, you know, I would, you know, why spend all of this money on a painting that looks, you know, so cleanly done? It doesn't make any sense. I want to see the hand of the artist. And that's very interesting, like that whole idea of that the pop artists kind of tried to challenge us to, like, what is art? Where does the art lie in a painting? Like, if you have a studio assistant help you do a lot of the work, or is it still your painting? And, you know, what if somebody else does most of the painting and then you just sign it at the end? That's outrageous, isn't it? Well, I don't know. Maybe that would mean a lot of the famous paintings that are in museums right now would have to be taken down, because that's how a lot of art was made. You'd have an apprentice do a lot of the heavy lifting, and then the master would come in and finish it off and sign it. And that's how artists, as they got more well-known, could make more than 1 or 2 paintings a year, because you'd have people helping you make those paintings. Now there's a number of artists, probably most famously an artist named Jeff Koons, who has a studio with dozens of artists in there, doing all of the painting for him, and I don't even know if he probably signs the back of it somewhere. There's another same sort of thing. Damien Hirst, a British artist, and who does the same sort of thing to make his dot paintings and spin paintings, which he sells for millions of dollars each. And so they become like not just small businesses, but like very powerful large businesses. Like when you're making products that are selling for millions of dollars and you're making dozens of them a month, you're no longer a little small mom and pop business. You've got a little factory running, right? So different people have very different opinions as to the legitimacy of pop art, and some people, there's definitely some people who to this day who think pop art was sort of the beginning of the end of art and destroyed art. That by taking so-called low culture and elevating it to high art, you sort of debased everything that was good about art. You know, all the refined quality of it, and brought high art down, right? In the same way that someone might say, you know, McDonald's ruined food. Did it really, though? Did people stop eating at really expensive restaurants and only eat Big Macs? So I don't know, I find all of this stuff very, very fascinating. And I'm definitely jealous of that there was a time where the majority, like the general public, knew who artists were and were engaged in the currents and the discussions surrounding fine art. Maybe not everybody, but you're like an everyday educated person. There was a time when if you went to university, you would probably have learned about the classics of art, the classics of literature, and now you have the majority of people know very little about music or art or literature, but could tell you, everything you want to know about, all of the details in the Star Wars universe. But at the same time, you'd say, well, George Lucas created Star Wars. All that came out of his own imagination. Is that not acceptable? Is that not acceptable for, you'd have to say that George Lucas has got to be the most successful artist of all time, right? He sold the rights to Star Wars to Disney for, I think it was $4 billion. That's crazy, right? I mean, so when people talk about like, oh, this is such and such a painting, how it's so ridiculously expensive. I was thinking about that today, because as we start talking more and more about all these expensive artworks, this painting sold for, in 1995, it was purchased for $1.7 million. 20 years later, in 2005, it sold for $104 million. I always say it to people, because a lot of people are like, why would any idiot pay so much money for artwork? 20 years to to take a $1 million investment and cash out with $100 million? I mean, what stock, or, you know, I mean, I don't know, what is there anything else that could possibly, besides like maybe like a betting on a horse that everyone thought was going to come in last, could get you anywhere near that return? It's the same sort of thing. There was, and we'll talk about Barnett Newman when we talk about when we do a Barnett Newman painting, but there's a very famous painting of his that was purchased by the National Gallery of Canada called Voice of Fire, in kind of the early 90s, and I think the Canadian government paid $1 million for it. You know, which probably in today's money would be, let's just say 10 million, right? And it was on the cover of every newspaper and magazine. Like, are you kidding me? They wasted $10 million on, which is essentially a canvas with a big stripe down the middle. And people were saying, you know, we've got to cancel the funding to art in this country. All of the politicians that greenlit this should be, you know, burned at the stake. This is an outrage. Our tax dollars, you know, were poorly used. That painting, if it was to go to auction today, especially because of the controversy, I would say it could easily get... It would easily get 150 million. I bet you it would sell for probably around $250 million. So what some people might say was the worst investment in Canadian government history, if the government ever wanted to sell it, which would be a bit of an outrage, but if they ever wanted to sell it, it would instantly become the single greatest investment in the government's history, just in terms of like seeing that the return on that investment. So art has been for a long time a great way for people to park money. It's a great way for criminals to launder money. That's a long history of criminals buying art or stealing art and trading it, selling it, you know, washing all that money out. Okay, almost done with all my red dots here. How long does it take me? About 45 minutes to get to this point. Almost done. Once we get here, there's just a little bit of blue, and then we'll put the yellow wash over the background, and then we're just going to be painting the black outlines. So it's going to take us, you know, a little bit of time to find some of those lines. But and if you painted those outlines, you'll be able to find them a little bit easier. It's going to be really interesting to see everyone's versions of these paintings, if people are actually attempting to do them, because we'll see a number of different versions. We'll see versions where we see some of the dots are bigger than what I'm painting. We'll probably see some that have dots that are smaller than what I've painted. I'm actually just going to go along the side here and do a little bit. I'm going to do that down here too. And this is sort of just in time because this red now is starting to kind of seize up a little bit. And either way, it's probably about time to wash this paintbrush. You know, if after an hour of painting with the same color, that paintbrush is, you know, it's kind of getting a little sticky as the paint is starting to kind of dry deeper inside there. Deborah says $1.8 million and the Canadians never got a say in whether we should buy it. It's only worth $34 million. That would be, if that painting ever went to auction, Deborah, I guarantee you it would sell for way more than $34 million. We're gonna paint a Barnett Newman painting that sold for, I think, $150 million. It's part of, you know, it's on that list. And Voices of Fire is probably his most well-known artwork because of that controversy, and that controversy sells when it comes to art. Any artwork that has that level of notoriety that was written about, again, I don't know where that value, maybe that's what the insurance value of it is, that the government would probably have to get it reinsured. But on the open market, it would sell for at least $150 million. And if you think $1.8 million on a painting is a lot of money, think about what our government spends every day on all sorts of ridiculous things, right? And some of us would have very different ideas about what's ridiculous and what's not ridiculous. But the fact is, a lot of that, you know, a lot of that money that's spent ridiculously either way is not really is going into somebody's pocket, right? We Canadians never got the choice to buy it. Yeah, I mean, but when are people in society really given a choice to buy anything? Like, the Canadian government, American government spends, the Canadian government spends, you know, a couple $1 billion every year on military equipment. The American government spends, you know, maybe 10% of the annual GDP on rockets and missiles and stuff. How many Americans are in favor of that? Right? I mean, I don't know. It seems to me like, and this is the way that that issue is always framed. Oh, we got to cut the arts because somebody spent too much money here and there, so we're going to cut. If we get rid of, you know, the $100 million that we spend on funding the CBC or PBS or anything else, that would be money well saved. Sure, but we spend that the amount of money that the government spend on arts and culture is like pennies on the dollar as to where the government spend their money on all sorts of other things. Anyway, I'm convinced it is literally probably the best investment that our government has ever made. So I mean, we can agree to disagree. Okay, so I'm gonna probably well, I wonder if I can get in there. What I'm going to use now, I'm going to use my cyan, or cerulean blue, my cool blue. And again, I'm going to put my self-leveling gel. I want to be careful. I might have put a little bit much there. And since I'm going to be... Blues tend to be a little bit more transparent. So just want to be careful about putting too much of medium in really any color. If you want to keep it opaque, you want to just be kind of careful about how much you put in there, because it will affect the opacity. Okay, so the blue that we're going to put in here is where these eyes go, and here on the shoulder. So there's not a lot of blue in here, but I think it's very important that we get it in on this painting. Now there is the highlights on the eyes. Okay. So they kind of look kind of sloppy like that, but I'm totally fine with that. I don't need it to look, because again, we're going to paint those black lines over top. And, you know, while it'd be really nice if we made really beautiful dots, I don't really... a lot of it's going to be covered up with black lines as well. Now there won't be black lines separating these, unless you want to paint them there. So these are just sort of going to exist as little lines on their own. You seem quite worked up about this, Deborah, about this particular painting, about Voices of Fire. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too much further down on there, but the fact that Barnett Newman was one of the most famous artists alive at the time, and so many people got so upset about it, is pretty embarrassing, I think, for Canada. Canada has had a number of instances like that. Also a very famous instance where Andy Warhol's work was labeled not art, and there was a whole trial that was conducted by the Canadian government trying to prevent Andy Warhol's art from entering the country because it was, you know, for tax reasons. It was, I can't remember, it was the Brillo boxes that Andy Warhol made in the 1960s, and there was all of these artists had to come and testify that Warhol was indeed an artist, and the Brillo boxes that he made were art. And again, it's one of the most embarrassing moments in Canadian history that we had to have an argument or discussion in the courtroom as to what constitutes art. I mean, it's pretty funny. I think Warhol found it very funny, but as an artist, it's like, I mean, Canadians don't really take art very seriously or have much appreciation for art, and it kind of made Canada, in terms of the art world, kind of a mockery. You know, that how it's definitely one of the lowest moments in Canadian history. And I would again say the Voices of Fire is also one of the most shameful moments in Canadian art history. And I do really think that Barnett Newman certainly would be right to call Canadians ignorant. I'm a Canadian, born and raised, but the vast majority of Canadians and Americans and everywhere else on the planet are horribly ignorant people. But, okay, so I'm going to blow dry this, and then I'm going to put some yellow over this area, which will convert it into much more of an orange look. Okay, so next we're going to, I think this is, we want to make sure this is about as dry as possible because we don't want to accidentally smudge, you know, these are like basically little zits, right, if they're not dry, and by going over them we could accidentally pop it and then smudge paint and it'll be a bit of a disaster. So let's, I'm going to get out our, I think I'm going to make a little bit of a, again, just like I did with the red, a bit of a mixture between my cool yellow and warm yellow. Mostly I'm going to use my cool yellow, but I'm just afraid it might be a little bit too much. Maybe it actually would be fine. Actually, now that I've put it on there and I see it, I think that cool yellow should be... I'm just going to take a little bit of warm yellow, just a tad. Okay, so now I'm just going to begin by painting in this hair here. Now obviously I'm going to paint all of this yellow as well. I just want it while if I start doing that, I might get a little bit lost with the shape of this hair. Okay. So let's put... I need a little bit more yellow in here. Okay. Oh, now I remember how I used to do this too, is I would paint this over and I would take like a rag and just sort of go maybe a little bit over top, just to kind of take a little bit of the paint off the top. So I paint kind of deep into, to make sure that this gets all covered with paint. Before I go too much further, I'm just gonna... And again, you can just decide on how dark you want these little dots to be. If you want it to be a little bit more orange, then you can let that you don't have to wipe any away if you don't want to. I'm just going to kind of maybe go back over some of this and just get a little bit darker, or a little bit more yellow on there, not quite as much as when I originally had, and then we can kind of brush some of it away. Okay. And then this hand. Oops, I just realized I went a little bit too far, so let's just get a bit of water. Okay, so you know, also at this point, you know, you might say, well, you could paint this white if you want. I'm going to leave it like this. I'm going to leave it just like the kind of, it looks sort of a little bit like the bare canvas showing through here. You could paint it white. You could paint the eyes inside there white. But once we paint the black line, like right now, the image sort of seems to have disappeared. Once we get some of our black lines on here, this is not going to seem so pale anymore. It's going to look a lot more white. It's because that black is so dominant, it's going to create a really intense contrast of everything around it, right? So this painting, at the moment, I think it's worth just taking a look at what it looks like now versus what it will eventually look like. It'll transform quite dramatically over the next hour as we work on it. So, I think today might be one of the few times where I'm actually just going to use black. We've done it, this was not unheard of, but I'm going to we could mix the black, and I do have, obviously, the colors to do it, but in terms of the process that he would have used just pure on black. And mixing our own black for something like this is maybe not the best use of our time and energy. I don't think it's because we really do want this black in this instance to really sit on the surface. We want it to be the closest thing to us, right? Whereas generally when I'm making my own black, I often want that black I make to maybe move a little bit further backwards into the background sometimes. So I'm just going to use this black. Now, I could also for probably the best results, as opposed to using a heavy body paint, would be to use a fluid acrylic, right? So here's, you know, your typical heavy body paint is probably, if you're like, oh, do I have heavy body? right? There's all sorts of different types of acrylic, right? So we have our heavy body acrylic paint, and then we have soft body acrylic paint, and then we've got fluid acrylics, and then high flow acrylics, and then even after that, we've got acrylic ink, right? So there's all of these different types of acrylic paint, and they all have different uses and purposes. The heavy body is obviously the thickest. Has the most body to it, right? And as we go from left to right here, we get thinner and thinner and more fluid-like, right? With the ink being the most fluid as possible. And so it's basically what the difference is that we have the same type of pigment. Obviously, these are different colors. I got black and blues and stuff in here. But it's the medium that is used to bind those pigments which differs, right? Because pigment at this point in time today is basically usually comes as a powder, and then we mix it with some kind of a binder that allows it to stick to things, right? And so your heavy body acrylic uses essentially like this, a matte medium, which is a lot like white glue. All of these other things use slightly different kinds of mixtures of chemicals. If we tried to paint ink on this canvas, the ink is ink will work. I've made lots of paintings on paper with acrylic ink. It works great for that type of purpose. It's just not going to be as opaque as I would want on this canvas. Same thing with the high flow acrylic. It's just going to be a little bit too thin. The fluid acrylic would be probably my best bet. Soft body is sort of in between these. So I might do a little bit with the heavy body and then do probably the rest with the fluid acrylics, just because it's going to save me time. Okay. So let's wait to use that, because I'll just sort of, in solidarity with everyone else who might not have all of these different types of materials, I'll try to do a little bit with this just to get started so you can see how I would use it. Again, some people might find this to be a little bit thick, so they're going to start adding water to it, which is going to thin that paint out, and you might then have to do 2 or 3 coats of that very thin paint to get something that is satisfyingly opaque. Versus if we use the fluid acrylic, we can do really nice brush strokes, do it once, and then you're done. So, where should we start here? Again, I'll probably just work from, and maybe, you know what, I'm going to blow dry this before I actually do any more. My fear is that some of this yellow that I've got on here might have, you know, it might still be a little bit wet, and that's just gonna, I don't want to smudge it with my hand. So let's do that here. Okay, so pull up my sleeves, because now I got to sort of dive in here and kind of get into the details. A lot of this so far has been, you know, you can kind of be a little bit mindless. It's sort of like Yayoi Kusuma doing these dots. It kind of becomes kind of meditative, like you just sort of fall into the rhythm. Now when we want to start putting these black lines on, we have to kind of be a little bit more left brain. You know, we got to kind of be a little bit more analytical about where these lines go. So maybe it's a different type of mental activity. Okay, so let's zoom in. I might do a little bit of these details afterwards. Some of these lines, what I want to do is get the main lines on the outside done, and that's going to really change things for me. So I'm just going to work on the outline to begin with here. Okay. So you feel free to take a lot of liberties with these lines in the top of the hair, because we have to remember half of this, basically what you see on the screen right here, does not actually exist in the original, right? So that's just my own in adding of that there, just to sort of make this painting fit onto this type size of canvas. Again, you see I'm just going to go around the outside here. That's just going to help me see the whole shape of things before I start dialing, because I don't want to just do one little edge and or side here and get caught up in the details. So right now the black paint holds up pretty well. As this paint starts to dry, it'll probably start to behave not quite as friendly. And then let's do... So this part of the painting he did by hand. So all of this, what we're seeing, would have been painted, like the black lines he did actually paint by hand. Although towards the end he did have some stencils that he would use to help this process as well. Like he would sort of like vinyl stickers he would paint on to help get really slick, sharp lines. But at least at this era, when he was making this painting, this would have all been good old-fashioned paintbrush on canvas. Okay, let's keep on going, or at least that's how I'm going to approach it. I'm going to do her chin in here. And I'm not going to make this the full thickness yet. I just want to define this. Just quickly. This is a black shape here. Got a little bit. It would have been nice if I had been a little more sensitive in this area here, but I think a little different shape is okay. Okay, that's the bottom edge of this painting. Now let's come all the way to the other side here. I'm just gonna keep on going here. Now I'm not sure how I want to treat this hand, so I'm just gonna paint this in here. Get those other details, including going into that dark later on. I'm going to do that hand in a moment. I'm going to do the things that are most obvious to me first. Okay. So let's just take a look at how that looks right now. Right? Like, whoa, quite the change, hey? Once we start getting these black lines in there, all of a sudden the kind of maybe the sloppiness of it or the indistinctness of it all of a sudden sort of starts to evaporate, and even these areas start to seem much brighter than they actually were. Again, I wouldn't be offended if you painted white here. I'm just gonna leave it like that though. Okay. Let me take a sip of tea. Tanya says, I might actually try this one. It appeals to the graphic designer in me. That's funny. There's a certain level of orderliness in this type of approach, it is sort of like you're a printer and you're doing the color separations individually by hand, and the last layer is always your black layer as well. So when I was in school, we did printmaking, and I did similar kinds of things like this, and building up, and then you put the last black layer on top because it pulls everything together. Everything all of a sudden looks really nice and clean with that black layer on there. Okay. So I'm going to continue using this. At the moment, I'm still happy using the heavy body black acrylic. You know, it would go a little bit faster probably if I was using the fluid acrylic. So we'll just maybe, rather than me putting more paint on here when I run out, I'll just use the fluid black acrylic to do that. Okay, let's turn that fan off. It's getting cold down here. So maybe even, well, I can reach this hand without having to to reach over here, but if once I start wanting to get closer in here, I will blow dry all of that, just because I'm not exactly sure. I just don't want to smudge this. After you've done a lot of this work, the last thing you want to do is sort of be doing a little, and then all of a sudden, oh no, then what you'd have to do if you made a big mistake is paint it out with some white, and then paint the dots again, and it's just a time-consuming process. And I'm sure, basically because of the way things tend to go on this program, is I'll usually make a mistake at some point and have to try to fix it, and then you'll see how I'll go about that. So I'll try to reserve that until it actually happens. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of go over these lines a little bit thin so that I can get them in the right place. Because if I do the lines really nice and thin, I can always widen one side a little bit more when I get there. Whereas if I do them too thick at this stage, it's like, oh, what am I going to do? I've kind of locked myself in there. So I'm going to keep it nice and thin. And this is sort of where the edge of the painting is, so I don't want to make these fingers too long if it's like, so I don't want to make those lines go right off the side of the canvas. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers, right? Instead of just making sure. And looks like I'm going to end up changing the direction of these nails just because of the brush strokes I've already put down here. Okay, so let's just see if I can get away with erasing that. Okay, that was close. So if that's her palm, the other side of her wrist is getting pretty close to the edge of here, so now I feel a little bit more confident expanding into this area here and kind of refining it. Okay. And I've got a little bit of paint on here, so not sure where that's coming from. Just trying to be mindful of that kind of thing, though. That's why your blow dryer can often be your best friend for this type of thing. So, you know, if we had painted some lines before this, it might seem like that would make things a lot easier. It would probably help a little bit if you feel like you're a little bit lost, or if you're just looking at mine and being like, wow, it'd be a little bit lost. But you'd still, because those red dots would have covered up some of those lines, you'd still have to be kind of searching around to find the right places to put them. So there's always a little bit of back and forth whenever you're making any painting. No matter what choice you make, there's going to be parts of it are going to make your life easier and things that are going to make your life a little bit more difficult. Make this area a little bit bigger. Okay. So let's move on. I'm going to come up here and do the lines along her face. do a big sweeping line here. Maybe this one will... Big head in the way there, as always. Again, I don't want to go too, let's zoom back out. Just show you where I'm at this stage. Like, even with the hand, where I really should have waited until I got a little further, because now I'm a little bit anxious that these fingers might have been a little thick. And might look a little bit more masculine than I think I ultimately want these to be. So that might mean I end up having to thicken some of the other lines on the hair and the eyes. But it is what it is, right? So I'm just going to keep on moving forward. I think actually at this stage, I'm just going to blow dry this because I got a lot of this wet black paint, and I'm starting to get some on my fingers, and I don't want to have to smudge anything here accidentally. So the other thing I'm going to do is just clean this brush that I've been painting with for the past little while, because I can even feel that it's the paint, there's acrylic that's inside there that's kind of dried a little bit. So I want to keep it as clean and fresh as possible. And I do have paint that's sort of kind of drying on the canvas or on the palette, so just always being mindful of how wet certain things are, because it gets a little frustrating to paint with dry or paint that's drying. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here. Maybe not quite. Well, actually, maybe I'll zoom in even further here, because we have to make some decisions as to where some of these fine details are going to go. Let me see. Oops. So start with that. Let's get this eyebrow. the details in those eyes. You know what? I'm going to wait in the nose. It's a little trickier to find, so I'm just going to go to what I can see, what the easiest areas are for me. So here's the interior of the mouth. I'm not quite happy with the shape of that, but we'll shape it a little bit more. Okay. See, I should have left a little bit more room there. But instead of trying to fix anything, right, I'm just going to wait until the painting is closer to being done. And then I can make a decision as to if there's a glaring issue. Same thing with the way I just did that teeth. Not my best work there, but that's okay. I'm going to move on to the other eye. Let's look for the eyebrow up here. Okay, once I've got that, now I feel much more confident about now that I got my eyes in place here, not all the way in. I haven't done the eyelashes and everything yet, but now I'm gonna come in, do a few other little details that I can see that are quite obvious. Maybe I'll even do those other lines shortly here. Let's wait. Let's get the nose in here. other little nostrils, kind of like a little. I'm looking at these here, seeing. Okay, that's the bottom. The bottom of that one should be not too much bigger. We want to be careful again about how big of lines we do when we get to the nose whenever we're painting a female face. Even that might have been a bit big. I made that nostril look pretty big. So I'm just gonna let that sit. I kind of gotta widen a few things here. Okay. Maybe even before, I'm just gonna do some of these stripes on her. I don't know what the name for the for this type of nurse's hat is called. I'm sure there's a very specific term for it. Other side. So maybe I'm just going to paint this here. Okay, so let's come back out. So Deborah says, what do you do about the paint drying on the palette? Do you add paint retardant? I think it's best just to, if it starts getting too tacky to paint with, I would just use more paint. That's why I would just not put too much paint on the palette at any one time. so that you're not wasting paint. But once it starts to get a little bit thick, you could put some medium in there, but it's going to make it thinner and thinner. And when I'm painting with these outlines, I want it to be as opaque as possible. So, yeah, I would try to, if you can, just use new paint, squeeze new paint out onto the palette, and just kind of move on from the paint that you found was not working for you. So now, again, this bottom part of the painting didn't exist. So we can make things up. You could put a logo on here if you wanted. You could do whatever you want in this area, and you'd be technically correct, because it doesn't exist anywhere. Gail says, oh yeah, for anyone who ordered the sample of the new flat golden paints, I got mine today. Interesting, I hadn't heard anything about flat golden paint. Maybe you guys were posting that on the Facebook group and I didn't read any of it, but I'm assuming what that means is some sort of paint that has probably some self-leveling qualities built into it, I'm assuming, or it's very matte. Here, well, let me decide if I want to put any kind of little extra marks down there. Maybe let's do a little bit more in the hair. Obviously I want to continue working on the eyes, but I just want to wait until I get a little bit more done, because when all these lines start appearing in the hair, it's also going to change the way I see the face itself. So you always want to just have a little bit of caution before you go too far. That's why I'm kind of moving around the whole picture, because only once I've got enough on here, that black paint changes everything around it. It's very hard to see the painting as it is. You know, that I'm just thinking about that flat golden paint. You know, paint companies are always trying to think of new ways to repackage the same thing differently, or add a little bit of something. I mean, obviously they're a business and they're trying to make as much money as they can, and so I get it. And, you know, if you're an artist who wants to paint with a particular kind of approach, having paint that's already pre-mixed and you don't have to put any additives in there certainly makes life a little bit easier. Having said that, like, you know, we've been using basically the same paints for almost all of these paintings, and you can see that we can do pretty much anything with this relatively limited palette here, right? So if you use it, I mean, that's a good, if you can get a sample of something and try it, or just 1 or 2 tubes of paint and try it and see if it works, that's great. But I would just hesitate before I would, you know, invest in, you know, 6 tubes of paint before you've really kind of tried it. And so, you know, maybe something like a black is a good color to test a new kind of set of paints with, because if you're painting with black a lot and doing outlines, testing what different blacks work, how they work, would be probably helpful. And most paints should be pretty interchangeable. Like, you should be able to mix, you know, like I could mix my acrylic ink into my heavy body paints, and I shouldn't see like a, you know, it's not like they're going to explode. I wouldn't foresee any sort of major issues, except maybe the drying time being affected a little bit, or, but you know, they're all they should work relatively seamlessly. That's not what the paint company is going to tell you. They're going to tell you that you have to use only their paints and only that particular set of colors, and if you want to, you know, that particular line of paint. But I've used different brands interchangeably for 20 years and never had any major issues. All right, there's like a little smudge here, so I'm just gonna incorporate that smudge in. Okay. Like, can you see how now this is, maybe it's not white like the one on the left, but it doesn't appear quite so pale as it once did. That black is such a high contrast that it changes the way our eye perceives that color, which I think is pretty remarkable. Our daughter's running around upstairs making some noise. And you know, I can see I made like a few little quote-unquote mistakes in here, but you know, I'm just gonna keep on going. Like, does it make much of a, does it really matter that I've taken these, that this is a slightly different than the original. I don't know, not according to me, but maybe according to some other people. Yeah, sure. Another thing, just thinking about like paint, one of the traps that us artists tend to get into, especially when you're sort of on the earlier part of your trajectory as an artist, is becoming obsessed with tools and materials and always sort of buying different kinds of, I mean, I've got way too many different kinds of things because it's like, oh, I think I need that. That's going to help my paintings. Whereas really the majority of, like, a good artist can use whatever materials are available and make something pretty good. Right? It's not like the material, like we've been, all of this paint that I'm using here, these Amsterdam brands, like this is considered to be like student grade paint. And so some people would say like, well, you know, you can't really make a good painting with student paint. Like the pigments aren't going to, it's just the colors aren't going to be very bold and bright and saturated. And if you had asked me 20 years ago, I would have totally agreed. I would say like, why would I waste my time using cheaper paint? Like, I might as well invest in the highest quality possible. And it's like, you know, there's a famous example of Picasso used the worst materials possible to do the paintings that he would do on commissions. Or not the worst, but he would skimp on spending the money on, if he was making commissions for people, he would just use whatever was available, cheap stuff. If he was making a painting for his family, he would use maybe the nicer paints, more expensive stuff. And I just think that's very funny. Like, and people who are spending a couple $100 million on some of his paintings, do they really care if the pigment isn't maybe as bright as it possibly could be, or as saturated? You know, it's the same sort of thing like with cooking. You know, if you don't really know how to cook, does spending a lot of extra money on the most expensive cut of meat from the butcher, you know, make any difference? Like, there's people who can do wonders with the cheapest leftover cuts of beef or whatever. I mean, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't eat any of it, but, you know, I mean, I've watched enough of those cooking competitions to see when they bring tripe out, or, you know, like some kind of meat that is generally less desirable, or sometimes even just gets thrown away because people don't like the look of it, or they find it difficult to cook with. A good chef is able to use whatever ingredients are possible and make something really great from it. But again, having said that, if like you find it very frustrating to paint with one particular thing and there's something else there that is made specifically for the way that you work, by all means, embrace it and run with it and use it, because there's no point in being frustrated unnecessarily, right? Okay. I'm just gonna, now this hand, I've got to do something here, so. Making this much wider. Bottom of the palm, and there's her wrist. So I've got to think a little bit more about how what if there's any, might want to do a line or something here for the side of that wrist. I'm going to darken this jaw considerably once I get more of this hair done. So again, I think it's a good idea just to check in with your wrist after, you know, every time you finish, you make a brush stroke, you're putting your hand in the middle of the canvas and just rotate it and be like, okay, is that dried paint? This is just coming from somebody who's made those types of mistakes hundreds of times. And I really think you should feel invited and free to play up here with this hair, because so much of it is just doesn't exist in the actual real original painting. So So a brush stroke like that would have, especially now that I haven't put any new black paint on my palette in a little while, or since I started painting these black outlines, and some of them, this paint is definitely getting tackier and tackier by the minute and becoming less, just more difficult to use. So I end up having to kind of go over brush strokes kind of again and again to kind of clean them up. And they're just not as crisp as you might want them to be when you first paint with them. Okay, let's just... Maybe we'll zoom in for a little while here. I've been zoomed out for... Okay, I'm so excited to kind of be almost done with this hair here. Okay. Oops, I couldn't see that, sorry. Okay, so how about let's zoom back out again, just see these two side by side. I mean, obviously all these big red dots on the face is very different, and if I had taken a lot more time, twice as long, I would have been able to do twice as good of a job and really kind of fine. Pascal says, eyelashes and mascara time. Yeah, I think we're about there, right? Okay. So maybe just before I do that, this area here has just been bugging me since I did that very, very quickly, not very opaque. So it's like the only big flat area of black, I think. Okay. So again, I'm gonna blow dry all of this so that I don't have to worry about smudging anything. Clean my brush. And we'll blow dry again. Okay. I think I'm just going to keep my black here is, there's not much, it's just the big thicker area is still going to stay a little bit more wet. Then obviously the thinner it gets, it's going to, as it spreads out, it gets thinner and it'll dry much quicker. Okay. So let's now zoom into these eyes. Okay. So, assuming I like where that is, let's do these eyelashes. Not sure how I smudged that. Where is that coming from on my hand? Okay. We'll come down here and get the bottom eyelashes. In fact, maybe I'll just widen this first. Okay, let's go to the other eye here. You may even need to make these eyebrows a little bit thicker and darker. Or not darker, they're already dark, but just thicker will make them appear darker. Okay. And then down below, it would have been nice if I had just a little bit. I could even take a little bit of white paint just to get the corner. But I don't know. We'll see. I'm not even going to touch that. Let's just think about that. This other eyebrow, I think we will also make that maybe a little bit thick now, but what are you going to do, right? This. Okay, let's just see how that all turned out. Whoa, those eyes might have gone a little bit overkill. I mean, it's also because the blue dots are so big, it makes those eyes look much darker than they actually are, but by adding a little bit more thickness to the bottom, that makes those lips look a little bit more full. I think I'm going to leave the nose as it is. And this is the mouth. I might do a little. I could even do. Well, let's see. Let's get the jawline and everything sorted here. First, and then we'll investigate. We want to keep this as round as possible, this chin. I want to try to avoid any kind of corners, otherwise it's going to make her jaw look very square and more masculine. And side of her face is a little bit, if we think about where her ear is, just for like her little bit of a cheekbone. Oops. Let's do that again. Very subtle. And in fact, I'm just going to just trim the side of her face right here to make it a little bit thinner. Up top there. So I'm kind of bringing the hair a little bit further onto her face there. And then these cheekbones here. So I don't know if I'll get... I don't know if I can get all 3 of them in here. We'll see. Okay, I think we're almost done here. It's probably another 5 minutes or so before we start wrapping up. Let me see. Let's just zoom back out a little bit. So Greg asks, I wonder where Roy got this image from, or did he make it up? He probably got this from a comic book. He was looking at a lot of romance comics for many of the images that he was painting, including another one that we'll be doing a couple months from now. Yeah, I mean, at least at this stage in the early mid-1960s, all of this was images from comics. And some of those like early romance comics are awesome. I own a few of them. I really like them. They're really well illustrated. Let's see. Just want to see if what it'll look like if I put a line in here. Now it's making, that looks not like what I wanted to do, the second mark anyway. First one, let's get that one out of the way too. You want to be careful about wiping too much, otherwise you can start literally wiping off other colors too. Oh, I was going to do those lips and make those a little bit darker. Okay, so let's do that. Okay. So I'm going to take, looks like this paint is kind of dried up, so I'll just kind of, rather than getting more paint on here, I'm just going to use this warm red. Let's zip down in here. And now I'm just going to try to, in fact, I might even use my small brush for this. I was going to use the same brush that I used to do a lot of the dots, but I'm going to make this. Ah, that brush is wet. Okay, I just took it out of the water, so it was. Let's try. This black is kind of... For a second I thought I was using a Posca pen because it almost seemed like it was smudging a little bit. I guess it's just I'm painting over the black and it's going a little bit transparent. Okay. Just taking my black and just cleaning up a little bit of this. So if we back out, right now those lips are much more red than otherwise. I don't know. I think I'm pretty happy. Do I want to make this a little thicker? Maybe just a few more quick marks and then we'll call it a day. Okay. Deborah says, Bill Waterston, the creator of Calvin and Hobbes, used the romance comics in Calvin's imagination playing Doctor. I'm sure that he copied this nurse for Susie. Calvin and Hobbes, that's interesting. That would be a fun one to do. I'm a big Calvin and Hobbes fan. I at one point in my life, I owned all of the Calvin and Hobbes books and read them all. That's interesting. That's a good suggestion, Deborah. Not that you were suggesting we do a Calvin and Hobbes painting, but bringing that up is very interesting. Okay. I think I'm pretty happy with this. Obviously, if I had spent more time, I would be able to get smaller dots, and it's worth just looking at a painting that I did 20 plus years ago. You know, these are the size of dots that I did very carefully. This is something that I would have made to sell versus this one here. I'm going a little bit faster just to demonstrate. It took me 3.5 hours to do the whole thing, but you know, that other one I probably spent 3 times as long on, and it looks a little bit better. Does it look 3 times better? I don't know. You be the guess. You be the guess? I don't know. I'm losing my mind a little bit here at the very end. So, just always being careful, and you never know what's wet and what's not. It's certainly like once, like the whole idea of the Ben-Day dot, like when we get further and further away from it, when we zoom out like that, you know, it's all the dots come together to create the image in the same way that this one does, right? In fact, we'd have to zoom out even further. I can't zoom out anymore. But if we were to look at this across the room, I think it would look a little bit more like the original does in terms of all these little dots. As we start, when we zoom in, everything starts to kind of look a little bit sloppier and messy. But I think that's part of the point of what Roy Lichtenstein was trying to do, is by blowing up those images and painting them large, doing all the Ben-Day dots, which even the way he did them were still much larger than obviously they appear to anyone looking at a newspaper or comic book, right? Most of those, when you're reading a comic book or a newspaper and you see a picture, you're not really even aware that they're done with dots. And it's not really maybe until Roy Lichtenstein did these paintings you become more aware of how they were constructed. And I think that's another really important part of what he accomplished through his art, is to make us question and take a second look at these images which are ubiquitous, that we see everywhere. Okay, so I think we're going to leave there for the day. On Tuesday of next week, we are going to wrap up our 5-episode Intro to Painting series. So we're going to be looking at value. We're going to be talking about, you know, we've already learned how to mix our own grays and blacks, but we're going to put those into use. We're going to do a value scale, and I think that's also really, really helpful for a lot of people, is to see how color changes when we add white to it to make tints, when we add black to it to make shades, and when we add gray to it to add, and when we add gray to it to make tones, right? I have to like, so tints, tones, and shades, those together create very different effects, which I think is kind of obvious to people when they think about it, but when we actually do it is a whole other thing altogether. Okay, if you enjoyed the show, subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you want to support the channel for even as little as $1, right, the price of a cup of coffee, you could leave a donation using the PayPal link below or the super chat here in YouTube. We'll see you guys next week. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next weekend. Upload your version of today's painting, and we'll talk about it in a couple of weeks, okay? See you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your night. Bye-bye, everybody.